Welcome once again to the Upper Room. Again, thank you for letting us come into your home and be a part of your lives. We'll be teaching again today from Matthew chapter 5 if you want to turn there. And holy cow, this is one of my favorite places we've ever filmed. We're actually going to break this lesson into two parts, and probably won't be until we get to the second part that you'll know where we're at, but we'll get to that eventually. There's a man who came out of surgery and his wife was in his room with him, and he was trying to come out of that anesthesia, and after about an hour his wife was very attentive to him, wanting to help him come out of that, and eventually he opened his eyes. They kind of fluttered open, and he looked at her and he looked at her again and said, "You're beautiful." And she got a big grin on her face, and he went right back to sleep. Slept another hour, and then once again she noticed his eyes started to flutter and opened up, and he looked at her again and said, "You're cute." And then she was offended for some reason, and she said, "What happened to beautiful?" And he said, "The drugs must be wearing off." I like that story because it truly is indicative of a reality that most of us don't want to talk about. And that reality is that from the time you stood at the altar with your future spouse to now, whenever that is, for us it's been 37 years almost, I'm assuming some things have changed. We don't really want to talk a lot about that, but it's the natural course of events. Has there been any, and this is it's not a discussion question, it's a real deep question, so you don't have to answer it with the people around you, but what things have changed about your marriage in the time you've been married? How has your perception changed? Now, I'm not encouraging you to go on anesthesia so you can experience that change once again, but I love that idea of that's reality. Things change over time in marriage, and that's going to be something we'll talk about today and what Jesus talks about. So the reality is that the person that you made vows with at the altar for us, again, almost 37 years ago, is not the same person that you thought you were marrying. Why is that? Because over, in our case, 3+ decades, you get to know that person really well. When Christy and I went to get our premarital counseling, we actually went to a friend of mine, which probably was a mistake, and he did the Taylor Johnson temperament kind of thing, the assessment, and was shaking his head as he looked down at the assessment, looked back at us, and then finally looked right at Christy and said, "You think you're marrying Jesus?" And he started laughing. And I can tell you, after all these years, she knows she did not marry Jesus. Not even close. So things change. Our perceptions change because of how well we get to know each other, and we get to know a truth that is not always pleasant, that each of us are fallen individuals, sinful human beings. Okay, so that being said, that is kind of the topic we're going to get into as Jesus now moves on in the Sermon on the Mount. We're calling this series The Lucky Ones, and it began with the Beatitudes, of course, where Jesus established, each Beatitude, by the way, built on the one before it, and Jesus established what life in the kingdom looks like, how it begins, then the process we go through of living life in the kingdom. Then he went on to talk about these two metaphors, that when we live life in the kingdom, we are like salt and we're like light. We should have an effect, an impact on our surroundings. And so from that point on, then he established that God's word is absolute authority. It's inerrant, it's perfect, and it'll last until this world is gone. And so having done that, he has now entered into 6 real life scenarios. And he's now going to teach on what it looks like to live as his followers in his kingdom in these different scenarios. And I said it before, I'll say it again, Jesus doesn't flutter around on the surface talking about sports and weather and politics, gardening. We mentioned that. He doesn't do that. He goes deep quickly. And the first one, and he has this phrase. Remember the phrase? "You have heard it said, but I tell you." He uses it over and over and over again because he's saying, here is the way you're used to thinking, but I'm introducing a whole new way of thinking. So he began with, "You have heard it said, do not murder." And I remember telling you, I stopped there and thought, I wish that's where it ended, because I got that one. Haven't murdered anybody, not going to murder anybody. I'm good, let's go to the next one. But he doesn't stop there. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, Paul writes that the laws are for the lawless or the godless. In other words, we would not need laws in life and in society if it weren't for godless people, lawless people, who don't have any internal constraints or ideas of judgment and discernment of how we should live in this world. Okay, so the laws are for the lawless. Do not murder is for the lawless. The lawless, the godless need to be reminded, murder's off the table. You can't do that. Now, for the rest of us who are not lawless, who are not godless, the people to whom Jesus was speaking, people who want to follow him and want to live in his kingdom, he then goes deeper, and then he talked about anger. You might remember that. So in his conversation about anger, we came to realize that basically anger is saying, you owe me, to whomever. You owe me. And when people owe you, we tend to get angry. Okay, so that we went into those depths. Now we get into chapter 5, verse 27. We're going to read the first 3 or 4 verses, break a little bit, then go on. And I think you'll find this fascinating. I do. Here we go, verse 27. But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So if your eye, even your good eye, I love that, we'll talk about that, your good eye causes you to lust, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your hand, even your stronger hand, causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Okay, stop there. Discussion question right off the bat. What's going on there? So is Jesus promoting self-mutilation? Is that what he's doing in this passage? Is that what it's all about? The trans community might say this is our favorite verse, as that's necessary if we're going to move around between genders. That's not what he's saying. I want to go back and get some specifics in this passage and then talk about what he's actually doing. When he says, anyone who even looks, that's the word blepo, and it's not the word glance or just a momentary notice. It is a long gaze or a stare. So whoever stares at a woman that is not your own and lusts after her from your heart, that means that you desire or deserve what you see. Okay? You desire it for yourself, or you deserve to have that for yourself. And it brings forth the idea of lust, which he introduces. By the way, lust is not the sin. Sin brings lust. Does that make sense? We often say, well, because you lusted, you sinned. No, there was sin in the heart, which then brought us to a point of lust, of desiring what is not ours and believing we deserve. So anger says that you owe me. Lust, in fact, means I deserve what it is I'm looking at and want for myself. Now, again, what is he saying? If you're not familiar with Jesus' teaching, and I'm not going to assume you are, you may not realize that Jesus is the greatest teacher of all time, okay, bar none. Now, he was much more than that. Obviously, he's the Son of God, but he was the smartest and brightest teacher, best teacher of all time. And so in that understanding, he used all kinds of forms of language. And one of those forms of language is hyperbole. If you're not familiar with hyperbole, it is using something as an exaggeration for an example. Okay, so I'm going to exaggerate my point by using this example. So what he's doing is using an exaggeration where he starts talking about cut out your best eye. Not just your eye, your best eye. See how you do without your best eye. See how you do without your best hand. Cut that off. What is he saying? Now, if you're hung up on that, I want to turn to C.S. Lewis once again, who was talking about people who take that literally and say, well, Jesus was saying to, cut off parts of our body. And people actually, throughout history, have done that. They've actually mutilated themselves saying, Jesus said, I have to do this to stop this process of lust. Look what C.S. Lewis says. The answer to such people is that if they cannot understand books written for grown-ups, or he says grown people actually, but he means grown-ups, they should not talk about them. All the scriptural imagery, like harps and crowns and gold, etc., is of course a merely symbolic attempt to express the inexpressible. People who take these symbols literally might as well think that when Christ told us to be like doves, he meant that we were to lay eggs. Isn't it possible that this passage was the inspiration for Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where the guys are sword fighting out in the forest and one guy cuts another guy's arm off and he has blood coming out and he says, just a flesh wound, and then he cuts off the other arm, then a leg and another leg, and each time he says, just a flesh wound, and then he's just a bloody stump, and he's saying, is that all you got? Is that the inspiration for this setting? I don't know, but it's kind of comical, and that's what hyperbole does. He is actually saying, if you understood the path that lust takes you on, much like he said with anger, if you understood the path of anger, if you understood the harbinger that anger is that will end in murder, if you understood the harbinger that lust is, you would do anything to stop it right in its tracks, because it ends up with adultery. Okay, so that's his point. Discussion question number 2. So what extents do you think someone should go to stop lust in their life? And again, I'm not just saying this to the men. Okay, when we say lust, we always think of men, but women also have desires for other relationships. It's not usually about physical intimacy for them, although it can end up that way. It's about having a different kind of relationship than what they're in, so they begin to desire what is not theirs. That's a different kind of lust. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. What lengths should we go to, do you think? Practically speaking, what are the kinds of things you would do, not cutting off your arms, or legs, or you're gouging out your eyes, but what kind of practical things should someone do in order to not let lust become a cancer in your life? Okay, I want to throw you a little bit of a curve now. Jesus begins this passage by saying, you've heard it said, do not commit adultery, and then he talks about lust, and so obviously we know what he's talking about, right? No, I don't think so. I don't think you realize that he's actually not talking about physical intimacy outside of marriage necessarily. He is talking about marriage. The word adultery immediately tells us the topic is marriage. So the first topic he got into was anger leading to murder. The second real life scenario is marriage. Most people, not all people, but most people get married. All right? You may or may not be married right now. You may be a widow. You may not yet be married. You may never get married, but most people are married. This applies to almost all of us, is my point. And there's an assumption that we cannot make. I heard a story once about a woman who was in the airport and she had a significant layover, so she thought she'd go to the snack place and hang out, and she got a little bag of cookies, and there was no place to sit except there was one chair at a table with a gentleman there, and so it was really her only option. So she went and asked if she could sit there at the same table, and he of course said yes. He looked up from his phone and said yes, of course. And so she got out her cookies and put them there in front of her on the table and opened them up, and she was just thinking about her flight, a little nervous about the flight, and so she was getting ready to take a cookie out of the bag, and the guy across the table, whom she'd never met, didn't even know his name, took a cookie. And she thought, he didn't just do that. But not being a person of, confrontation, she wasn't going to say anything, so she took a cookie. And this went on for a half hour. He took a cookie, she took a cookie. And she was inside, talking about anger, getting angrier and angrier until there was just one cookie left. And she's wondering now, and the guy is really not even looking at her, he's just looking at his phone, and she's wondering now who will get the last cookie. He reached into the bag, took the last cookie, and had the gall to break it in half and offer half of her own cookie. She took it and now was infuriated, got up, left, went to her gate, and the whole time is thinking, men these days, what in the world? You can't even sit down, and she's going on in her mind, talking about what a terrible human being he was. She sits down, she thinks, well, I need to get that off my mind, I need to read. She opens her bag, goes to grab her book, and there's her bag of cookies. It never was her bag of cookies, but it was assumed, she assumed it was. Assumptions can be tricky, can't they? So here's the assumption I think we tend to make. Marriage is marriage, right? We have different kinds of marriages, but marriage is marriage. When you hear that somebody got married, you instantly say, well, they just entered into the one kind of marriage there is, a marriage. Now, it'll be different than other marriages, but marriage is marriage, right? That's an assumption we make. I'm here to tell you today that that's not accurate. You can't make that assumption. There are two kinds of marriages, and Jesus is going to expose the one, and then we'll get to some passages where he'll talk about the other. So the first kind of marriage I want to introduce to you, I want to tell you about something that happened in the last 2 weeks. As you know, the Upper Room is a nonprofit, and I've really never been in a leadership role of a nonprofit per se. I mean, not counting local churches. And so we get things in the mail all the time, you know, that we need to pay attention to. And I got a form in the mail from the Compliance Center of Colorado, because annually you got to pay a fee to the Secretary of State. And the fee on this form was $75, and I thought, well, I just better pay that and get that done with. But the longer I looked at it, I thought, man, I don't know if this is accurate. And I talked to my friend Doug, and because he's helped, you know, put this whole ministry together, and he said, well, I remember paying that last year, and so you go ahead and pay it. And I was getting ready to write the check, and I looked at it one more time, and I all of a sudden started reading the fine print. Okay, I'm not a fine print guy. I don't know if you are a fine print person. When I go to buy a car or a house or anything, I'm way trusting. I do not want to spend the time on the fine print. I don't even like the fine print of directions and how to put anything together. My wife does that, you know, but I just thought, I'm going to read the fine print. I want to read to you a paragraph I read that did not make me feel better about this form. And it goes like this. You are to fill this out no later than the last day of the second calendar month following the first anniversary of the calendar month in which the reporting entity's constituent filed document or statement of foreign entity authority, as the case may be, became effective, or in the case of a reporting entity that has been reinstated or that has cured its delinquency, no later than the last day of the second calendar month following the first anniversary of the calendar month in which the reinstatement or curing of the delinquency occurred. Unless otherwise elected, you are subject to a penalty which shall be determined and collected pursuant to section 2421-104. I just read that. The worst part of this, as far as I'm concerned, because I like grammar, that's the worst run-on sentence I've ever heard. Now, it does sound governmental, doesn't it? So I think they put that in so we would read that and go, oh, this is from the government. But then there's this other little line at the very bottom that said this. I understand that Colorado Compliance Services is not a government agency and is not providing legal service. Steve, I hope you have a point to reading this boring form. I do. I finally, instead of writing the check to this compliance company, I finally decided I'm going to call the Secretary of State of Colorado. So I called them, left a message, they didn't call back. A couple days later, I called them back. This time I got Karen. Got Karen on the phone, and Karen said, can I help you? And I said, yes, I got this form. It's called the Compliance Form of Colorado. And I started to read it to her, and she just barged into to my conversation, you know, just stepped right in the middle of it, and she said, that's junk, throw it away. Thank you. I got an amen. I loved that. She goes, that's junk, throw it away. I said, well, do you want me to read the rest of it? She goes, no, you don't have to read it. I can tell you, it's junk. We don't send things through the mail. Yes, you do owe us $10 a year as a nonprofit, but that's junk. It's all fake. Throw it in the trash. And I thanked her profusely, and I so appreciated her cutting through all the BS. Now, in our family, BS means big story, so I'm assuming it means the same thing in your family. So I'm just saying that that form was a BS. It was a big story. It didn't need to be attended to. It was going to cost me. In fact, she said, how much are they charging you? I said, $75. She goes, oh, that's not bad. Sometimes they charge, you know, $110, $150. The point being, I loved how she cut through it. Jesus cuts through the conversation about marriage to differentiate that there is not just one kind of marriage. And I want to call this trash talk about junk marriage. That's what I want to say. Karen told me, throw it in the trash. It was trash talk. Throw it in the trash. It's junk. I believe what Jesus is doing, and I'm guessing you've never heard this take on this passage. I believe what he's doing is junking the trash talk about marriage, okay? That this kind of marriage that is filled with lust for other women, other people outside the marriage, ends in adultery, and as we're going to see, divorce. I believe Jesus, in other passages we'll read, will say that's junk marriage. That's a kind of marriage that I'm not talking about. So I am indebted to Karen from the Secretary of State's office for just reminding me that sometimes you just got to cut through it. You know, don't mess with it anymore. So what is this junk marriage about? Well, the junk marriage is basically a contractual agreement between a man and a woman, and it is between a man and a woman. We'll talk about that, but it is a contractual agreement that is very much convenient in its nature and culturally relevant. I mean, something the culture really approves of. Let me give you a few things that you can identify junk marriage or contractual marriage by. Number one, it's made for a limited time. Everybody understands this may be a limited time commitment, and that's the dating mentality, all right? You may have never connected that. Why are marriages the way they are? Because they're just an extension of dating. If dating is the path we choose, which is a cultural idea, no example in Scripture of dating. It's a temporary thing. I'm going to date you until I'm tired of you, and I'll move on to the next one. We take that dating mentality into this kind of marriage, and it makes total sense. The second way you can identify it is that it always deals with my happiness, right? I'm in this because you make me happy. In fact, we now know that Disney is a junk corporation, but it was Disney all those years that taught us, and they lived ever after. They lived happily ever after. That's junk theology. That's junk marriage. Nobody lives the rest of their life happily no matter what. But if I'm in this, if happiness is my ultimate goal, as we've said the culture says it is, and if my feelings are my guide, this is going to be not a permanent arrangement. The third thing you can notice about the junk marriage, the cultural marriage, is it's based on the if-then idea. If you will do this, then I will do that. All right? If you will take me to Hawaii, then I'll let your family move into our house. You know, that kind of strange arrangement, you know, and it's very conditional. The fourth thing you'll notice is that it's about me getting something I want, kind of like the happiness thing. There's something in this for me. And again, I've sat down with so many couples before they've gotten married and tried to break the news to them that you will not live happily ever after. And they look at me, you know, and they both do this, but it's always for sure the gal who goes, "What? No, we'll never fight. We'll always be happy. You know, I love him. How could I ever be upset with him?" Oh, you wait. You wait. Those days are coming. And the fifth common trait of the junk marriage is that there's a lot of unspoken and implicit ideas. Things we're not going to talk about until much later. And hopefully we'll never talk about it, but it'll be understood. This is the way things are, okay? That is junk marriage. That is a cultural understanding of how a couple of people, a man and a woman, commit themselves. They say for life, but all these conditions are placed on it, and that just doesn't work. And that's not when Jesus talks about marriage in terms of what, you know, he created, and we'll get to that in the next lesson. That's not how that works, but that's how this works, and that's what he's addressing. Adultery, it started with the harbinger of lust, and now he's going to get into how that all eventually ends. So Jesus will move on to how this ends eventually, but before we get to that, I want to look at the context of the time in which Jesus is teaching this. And the context is this: it was a very male-dominated society, male-dominated culture. If you think our culture is male-dominated, not even close. That was a male-dominated culture, and it was men, he was talking about especially men who were the elite, the wealthy, the powerful, who had a certain perspective on women. and it led to these junk marriages. And this perspective on women was that they were objects that were there for their own pleasure, and when they no longer brought them pleasure, then they could be done away with. Okay, anytime in marriage where we start to look at our spouse as an object that is there to make me happy, it qualifies as junk marriage. So the idea of looking at women as objects, it makes sense then to lust after other women, because they're just objects. And when we lust after other women, when we're in married life and I look and desire and believe I deserve other women, I am seeing them as objects, right? That's pornography, actually. And I'm also seeing my own wife as an object who no longer makes me happy, no longer meets all my needs. Okay, that's the context in which Jesus is teaching. You guys are stirring up dust, and it's so funny to have an audience.
They're a captivated audience.
They are so interested. You are more interested than anyone that will watch this video. So what's our context today? Well, pornography. In 1953, a guy by the name of Hugh Hefner began a publication, a magazine called Playboy, and in that, by presenting that to the culture, he was presenting a new idea, and that is, you can now look at women as objects, and it's absolutely okay. You know, there's no crime in just seeing them as an object to bring yourself pleasure. And the culture accepted it, and now the pornography industry is an $8 billion a year business, and those statistics are old. $8 billion in looking at women as objects. 47% of the homes in America, studies show, have had a negative impact from pornography. Now think about that. People who are rejecting what Jesus is saying in this text, absolutely rejecting it, people inside the church and outside the church, have as a result broken marriages, broken homes, abuse, abandonment. Several years ago, two guys wrote a book called Every Man's Battle, and it has to do with this ongoing battle with lust and where that leads, and eventually to addiction. These two guys wrote this book, and they candidly said at the time, we might sell 5,000 copies. 3 million copies later, they said, this touches a nerve. So now junk marriages have become the norm in our culture. Not only have they twisted it so that now a man can marry a man, a woman can marry a woman, man can marry an iguana, a woman can marry an orangutan, you know, whatever. Not only has that been twisted, but the idea that divorce is really no big deal has become the norm in our culture. So Jesus began with the end in mind. This can lead to adultery, but now he gets to the real bottom line. In verse 31 of chapter 5, he says this, "You've heard the law that says a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a written notice of divorce. But I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery." So now he connects those two absolute tragic situations together. Now, is this the only time Jesus will talk about marriage? Of course not. So if you'll turn to Matthew chapter 19, we'll see that Jesus deals with this subject matter even more in depth. We start in verse 3 of chapter 19. Some Pharisees came to test him. They asked him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" Remember the context. All right. Now, there are two schools of thought amongst the Jewish people. There was a leader named Shammai that said that you really shouldn't divorce your wife unless she does something really terrible. But then there was the school of Hillel. And Hillel disciples, if you will, people who followed the school of Hillel, believed that you could divorce your wife for pretty much any reason. Let me give you some actual reasons that they wrote down that said these are acceptable. This is just give you just the tip of the iceberg, a taste of what they believed was acceptable reasons to divorce their wives. She spoiled the dinner by adding too much salt. I'd assume that if there wasn't enough salt, it could be the same kind of offense. Ladies, ever done that? Number 2, she was seen in public without her head covering. Number 3, she talked with other men on the street. Number 4, she spoke disrespectfully to her husband's parents. Number 5, she became plain looking compared with other women who seemed more beautiful in her husband's opinion. Ladies, raise your hand. I see those hands. How many of you would be divorced in those days? Your husband would have left you. Can you imagine? In this day and age, I mean, you know, our poor wives, how could they measure up to the airbrushed fake pictures of women that we see all the time, right? I want to divorce you. Why? Because they were junk marriages. That's what these guys were talking about. They're saying, okay, we want to trap you because you're going to choose one of these, and that means you'll divide half of our group into hating you right off the bat. And so that's their goal here. In chapter 4 of verse, you don't know how distracting it is to have an audience like this. They're so disrespectful. In chapter 19, verse 4, Jesus responds this way. This is classic, easy to read past this. He says, have you not read? You and I have no idea what a shot across the bow that was. How humiliating that was to these guys. These guys were experts in the law. That's what they did. Nobody knew the law like they did, which meant, of course, we've read it. And he says, maybe you've not read. Have you read this? And then he goes on. That at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female. Okay, a couple of problems. If you're an evolution person, this causes a problem. Jesus was not an evolution person. All about creation. Secondly, it's as though there's some foreshadowing here that someday there'll be more than two genders created. Talk about junk science. Not just junk marriage. Male and female. XX, XY. Okay? XY, XX. We talked about that. Follow the science. You guys doing okay? And then in verse 5 he says, and for this reason a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. That's a stern warning from the lips of the Son of God. God created marriage. So wonder there's a war on marriage. So wonder there's cheap counterfeits that we're calling junk marriage. All right? So wonder. God created it. He brought man and woman together. And he says, whoever separates that, whoever pulls that apart, whoever destroys what God has done, you're in serious trouble. Again, why has divorce become so prominent? Divorce has become so prominent, 50% inside the church and outside the church. It's become so prominent because we want what we want and we will not be told no. And after a period of time, we've had enough. There's an author by the name of Dr. Ted Roberts who wrote a book called Pure Desire. And I love what he said. He said, the difference between a man and a boy is that a man is willing to live a life of delayed gratification. That's a man. Sorry, ladies, you're married to a lot of boys who want gratification right now, right here, right now. And if you don't give it to him, he'll look elsewhere.
The audience is leaving.
What did I say to offend you? Will you too leave? So Jesus says divorce is unacceptable. And then those who are there to trap him go one step further. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted, that's the key word, did not command. Moses allowed, he gave this concession. He permitted you to divorce your wives because, not just that he did it. Don't focus on the fact that he just did it. The Pharisees were so focused on what are the grounds of divorce so we can get rid of these objects called wives. He says, here's why. Because your hearts were hard, but it was not that way from the beginning. The original concept of marriage my father and I put together was that people would care for one another, would not look at each other as objects. He goes on, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. The disciples now chime in. They've been listening to this back and forth, and they chime in, and we're going to get back to this again in the next lesson. They chime in and they say, if this is the situation between a husband and a wife, I love that phrase. If this is the situation, what's the situation? This has really gotten much more complicated than it was supposed to be. This has become junky. If this is the situation between a husband and a wife, it is better not to marry. That's what the disciples said. As far as we know, many of them were married. They're not talking about their own wives. They're saying this thing that you created, has really fallen on hard times. There's a cheap imitation of what you had in mind. I think they're saying, then why would we even take part in something that's been so distorted? Great question. We're going to answer that question in the next lesson. While the Pharisees took divorce very lightly, Jesus takes it very seriously, and he gives a reason for it. And the reason was to protect these women so that they were not trapped in a situation where they're treated as slaves, as objects, and then thrown out without a certificate of divorce so that no other man would ever even look at them. The concession that God told Moses he could give women is, get your paper so that your life can go on because you're precious to me. But the point of this whole part of the Sermon on the Mount is not just adultery. That's a small piece of it. It is marriage, and what is it supposed to look like, and what has it turned into. I believe as he's gone through this, he has said, here's an example of junk marriage. This was never what was intended. It's a cheap fabrication, a cheap imitation of the real thing that most people now have accepted. I mentioned earlier there's two types of marriages. One, of course, is the one we just spoke about, the contractual, cultural, convenient relationship. There is another one. I want to close by showing you a picture. This is an actual picture that hangs on my mom's wall in her house. And I knew the story behind it, but I'd forgotten the details. I asked her about it last week. And the story behind this picture, and you'll see it here, it looks like a beautiful painting. It comes from Germany, and we received it from our aunt and uncle who lived in Germany for a time, and they brought it back to us in about 1963, something like that. I mean, so this thing is old, old, old. And I want to tell you, that picture has not faded one bit. It looks exactly like it looked when they brought it from Germany in the early 60s. Now, how is that possible? Well, what you can't realize by looking at it as a picture is that that picture is not paint. It is all wood. Every piece of that picture is a piece of wood. The details are so intricate, and it is so authentic and genuine. It will never fade. It's not paint that can fade when oxygen hits it and it goes through different circumstances. This is the real deal. This has looked that way for as long as I've been alive. Now think about that. That's the real. That's the authentic. You could paint a picture that would look like that, but it wouldn't be that. There are marriages in this world. Some who are authentic, we're going to now talk about those. Others who are fake replicas. We just talked about those. I'm calling them junk marriages. I hope you're not offended. I hope you're beginning to think deeply about the kind of marriage you want, the kind of marriage you're a part of, the kind of marriage God intended. And what then do we do next? Thanks for joining us. We'll pick this up